Hey guys, welcome back. This is Civil Rights Movement Part 2. We left off talking about school desegregation, and now we're going to continue with the growing civil rights movement. And we'll continue with the very famous Alabama bus boycott. This started in December 1955 when Rosa Parks was very famously arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. All right, basically violating a law, a city law that required buses to be segregated, black people in the back, white people in the front, and black people had to give up seats if a white person asked, etc. Right? So a very young Martin Luther King, I believe he was only 26 years old at the time, is going to come in from Atlanta, come on over to Montgomery, Alabama, and he is going to organize a protest. All right. And this protest is going to be in the form of a boycott. Basically, he's going to organize all of the black people in Montgomery, all of the black citizens, to boycott the city buses, not ride, right, as a protest to this segregation law. And Martin Luther King was very influenced by this idea of nonviolent protest, right? Thoreau kind of first put this forth, this idea of civil disobedience, right? Gandhi had practiced this, of course, in India, right? Protesting British rule in India. Um, so Martin Luther King was very much inspired by this as a way to fight segregation and discrimination, all right? And this boycott in Montgomery lasted for over a year, right? Um, and it was very, very effective because most of the riders of the city bus there in Montgomery were the black citizens, right? So this very much hit the bottom line of the city. Later, this law was overturned in the Supreme Court case Browder v. Gale. And the success of this boycott, in addition to what was going on with school desegregation with the Brown ruling, is really going to kick off more protests and demonstrations to end these Jim Crow laws in the South. Martin Luther King went on to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, as a way to organize further action. And this is really key to understand the role that Black churches played in leading and organizing the civil rights movement. Black churches were really a centerpiece of the Black community, going all the way back to after the Civil War. And so what we see is various organizations, including SCLC, start to organize tons of different types of protests and demonstrations. One is going to be CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. That's a really important one. We actually had talked about that before because it was founded during World War II, right? They were really committed to that idea of nonviolence as well. And then also another group called SNCC, or SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. All right. And in 1960, we're going to see the very famous Greensboro sit-in. So this started here in Greensboro, North Carolina, as a sit-in at this lunch counter at this department store that had banned Black patrons from sitting at this lunch counter. So basically, a group of Black students went in and protested this white-only restaurant counters at the Woolworths department store. And they basically did this by sitting, by refusing to leave. All right. And they were harassed and taunted and jeered, as you can see. But they kept with that process of just sitting and not responding in violence, right? But just sitting there in their act of civil disobedience. And eventually the company gave in and they desegregated all of their lunch counters and all of their stores nationwide. And so the protest was successful. And this really became a popular movement, a popular protest method. All right. And we'll see that this continues to grow, this civil rights movement, as we get into the 1960s. In 1961, CORE and SNCC are going to organize the so-called Freedom Rides. This would be a journey here to travel on interstate buses, starting here in DC and then traveling through the deep south. Um, as a way to test a recent order to desegregate those interstate buses. But they faced a lot of violence on the way. As you can see here, they were harassed and beaten. One bus was bombed, in fact. And then another big one happened here in Birmingham in 1963. These were public demonstrations that were organized by Martin Luther King and the SCLC, to protest segregation in Birmingham. All right, Birmingham, Alabama is known as the most segregated city. And what we see is white Southerners, including like government officials, police, right, and your everyday average citizen, are going to very much resist pushes for desegregation. They're going to respond violently to many of these non-violent protests, right? To the freedom rides. There was a bombing of a black church in Alabama that killed 4 little girls that were inside. But what brought a lot of attention were these Birmingham demonstrations. Birmingham was picked specifically because Martin Luther King knew it would elicit this type of response from the local political leaders and from the police. All right. And it was pretty crazy to see these young protesters who were really just teenagers and young adults, getting hosed down like this, having police dogs attack them, and things like this. And this was reported on television and in the media, and it brought a lot of attention for the civil rights movement. President Kennedy was initially kind of reluctant to support civil rights. He, was more concerned about what was going on in foreign policy and some of his other domestic policy plans, like putting a man on the moon, right? He was also concerned about that large group of Southern Democrats, right? They had been in solid opposition to any progress on civil rights. Plus, like I said, Kennedy was kind of distracted. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have, stuff going on in Vietnam and whatnot that is a bit distracting. But what we see is those media reports really start to change his and the American people's mind. The violence, in the freedom rides in Birmingham especially brought a ton of attention to the movement, and television especially played a really big role here. It really, brought all this right into everyone's living room, and they could visually see what was going on. And it forced the public, it forced the government to recognize this issue. In June of 1963, President Kennedy came out in support of the civil rights movement and asked Congress to take action, right? A couple months later, we see the very famous March on Washington. This took place in August of 1963. It was officially known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? And this is a big public demonstration organized by Martin Luther King and his leaders and his followers to call attention and really force Congress to say, hey, we need to do something. Of course, it was at this event that he gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech. All right. One of my favorite quotes is here. Kind of reminds me a lot of the Gettysburg Address. He said, when the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what we see here is success. As a result of this, we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, Kennedy had been killed in November of 63, so President Johnson is going to ensure the passage of this bill. This is going to specifically outlaw discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, specifically ended segregation in schools and the workplace and in public places, created the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission to provide more equality in the workforce. At first, it was a little bit difficult to enforce because it's such a vast, sweeping law. However, it has really become the basis for equality in the US between races and genders and religion, right? And it hasn't just been used, of course, by African Americans, but by other minority groups, and especially by women as well, all right? After this, the attention came to voting rights, right? We wanted to end those voting restrictions, those poll taxes, literacy tests. This is going to be a key to the movement. If we want it to be successful in the long run, we want political participation among Blacks, right? Especially in the South. In 1964, civil rights groups launched Freedom Summer, this voter registration campaign throughout the South. And also in 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified, which specifically outlawed poll taxes. And then in 1965, we see the passage of the Voting Rights Act. This was in response to a protest, the Selma March, which had also turned very violent. This outlawed literacy tests and gave the federal government oversight through the Department of Justice of elections in southern states. And you can kind of see the impact here, right, of voter registration. Like, look, in Mississippi, only like 10% of Black voters were registered before the passage of the law, and then it went up to 60%, right? So it had a huge, huge positive impact. One thing I want to point out though is that we have seen some rollbacks in 2013 in the case Shelby County v. Holder. The Supreme Court actually struck down a provision of the Voting Rights Act. Previously, it said that states that had a history of discrimination required federal approval for any changes in their voting laws. But this was ended here as a result of that 2013 Supreme Court ruling. And so we have seen some kind of rollbacks on this, and there's been a lot of attention paid to this issue of voting rights and voter suppression, all right, in more recent years. So we will go ahead and end here. Again, this was Civil Rights Movement Part 2.